I'm really, truly glad to be here. I have to say today has been like an idea spa. I've taken all of the ideas I've had for a while and I've taken them on the spa and have shared them with a variety of people who have given them wonderful attention that they needed. This has been really, really fun to be here. So thank you for having me. Today's talk, I'm going to really have two parts to today's talk. One is confirmatory work. I'm going to describe a randomized controlled trial of the responsive classroom approach, some work that I've been conducting over the last few years. And then also the part that I think is the most exciting in some ways, the exploratory work, which is what occurs inside a classroom in the presence of responsive classroom. So now I've picked up the vernacular here, and I understand what I'm supposed to say. This is just observational work, the second part, exploratory work, because I've heard many people say that, and I won't apologize for doing observational work. I'll come clean. I'm a developmental psychologist. I view schools as a context for kids' development, and I think it's really important that we understand schools that way, because a lot of the decisions that we make have very clear implications for the way that teachers interact with kids and how kids interact with each other, and we need to understand that because those are the exact processes that are contributing to kids' development. So even though it's exploratory work, I believe this is incredibly important to understanding schools. So let me introduce a few of my collaborators and tell you about some of the funding sources. Let me first figure out this microphone. There we go. Sorry about that. I don't want to make a noise. I'm just going to hold it. Okay, I have a few faculty collaborators at University of Virginia. Robert Berry, Tim Kirby is at GMU, and Jito Fan. And then I have a group of postdocs who have worked really arduously on this work that I'll be describing. A really terrific group of staff members and some doc students who've carried a tremendous amount of the load in this work. I've worked with this incredible district that I've worked with for 5 or so years, and they have really been incredible. And I'm always grateful to the people in the research team in those districts because they end up doing a lot of unglamorous work. And then the work that I'm describing is funded through IES and NSF. Some of it through research grants and some of it through pre- and postdoc training grants. I often feel like I should send them thank you notes. Okay, so raise your hand if you've been in a classroom in the last 5 years or so. Okay. Okay, so I just want to get a sense of that. So I'm going to describe a little bit about what I would see in a fourth grade math classroom. A fourth grade math classroom that's using standards-based math in that classroom. So the kids went out to a park, and the teacher demonstrated, drew a line around a particular area of a park, and the kids were watching and looking in that area of the park, and they had to count how many squirrels and pigeons they saw in that small area in the park. Then they went back to their classrooms, and they all got maps, and they got maps of the park. And then the kids had to work in small groups, and what they needed to do is estimate how many birds, how many pigeons, and how many squirrels there would be in the whole park based on the number of squirrels and pigeons they saw in that small part of the park. Now, when you think about a lesson like this, it was designed to really teach problem solving and to do some work on estimation and to teach some number sense. So it has these mathematical elements to it. When you think about what has to happen to make a project like that happen, is now the kids are supposed to go back and they work together in groups. So they need to know how to take turns. They need to know how to listen to each other. Okay, so they're working together in groups, but we've all worked in groups where one person does all the work and the other people just sort of sit back. So how do they share that task? How do they work together? What if somebody in that group wants to take a risk and make a comment? Do they feel comfortable taking a risk and saying, I think the answer is this, in that group of kids? So there are all of these social skills that are really required, and also classroom management skills. When you think about a map, there's a million ways to fold a map. Well, you need to teach kids how to take care of a map in order to use a map. A lot of times when teachers are talking about handing out manipulatives in the classroom, the first thing they say is, well, the kids don't know how to use them. Well, you need to sort of set up how to use the materials in the classroom. So these are all things that need to happen. And in a seamless math classroom, all those things will happen in order for this lesson to actually teach the kids math. In many math classrooms, doing an exercise like this seems out of reach because it has so many moving parts and involves so much social engagement. So in essence, teachers are tasked with the issue of being able to give kids the social and self-regulatory skills to be able to pull off a task like that. So I'm going to describe, so the premise for this task is from the National Council for Teachers of Mathematics. And in 2000, they put out a set of standards. And in those standards, there's a set of content standards, and that speaks to the, knowing number sense, knowing things about algebra, the content of the math. And then there's also a set of process standards. And the process standards are about ways of doing the math. And these things include things like discourse. So you need to be able to talk about a mathematical idea. Or representation. So you need to be able to represent mathematical ideas in more than one way. So, being able to go from, the kind of like the pizza model of fractions to, fractions where you have 12 buttons, and that's considered the whole of the 12 buttons, the numbers approach. So that came out in sort of 2000. And now the standards, there's also a set of standards that followed from that are really designed for teachers. And these are the skills that teachers are supposed to have to be able to teach in a standards-based manner. And here's standard number 4. Students work independently or collaboratively to develop skills, make conjectures, and develop arguments within a mathematical community that values the contribution of all participants and defers to the authority of sound reasoning in the search for mathematical truth. Now, I read that and I thought, that's really hard to do in a 4th grade classroom. I have a hard time doing that with a group of graduate students. I mean, that's setting a very, very high bar for what is supposed to happen in a classroom. So when I was in school, and probably many of you, when you were in school, you would have a math problem. It would look like this. This would be a standard way you would learn, area of perimeter. But if you're looking at the standards-based math, and I should say that the Common Core standards have inculcated a lot of the NCTM standards into them. So they're really integrated into those. But this is a more traditional math task, whereas this might be a more standards-based math that you would see in a classroom using more standards-based math. Suppose you had 64 meters of fence with which you're going to make a pen for your large dog named Bones. What are some of the different size and shape pens you can make if you use all the fencing? What does the pen look like with the least play space? What's the biggest pen you can make, the one that allows Bones the most play space? Which pen size would be best for running? So it really gets at area and perimeter in a whole different way, and in a very practical way. And there's more than one solution to this type of problem. So I see this as the standards-based math. When I see teachers doing this well, I see it's very, very challenging. And there's a lot of skills that kids need to have in place and the teachers need to have in place to be able to make this happen effectively. So that brought me to this question. Are there teaching strategies available that set the stage for standards-based math instruction? And so are there things that teachers can do to kind of make that much more accessible, to make that kind of math teaching more accessible? I turn my attention in this to looking at social and emotional learning interventions. And here I'm going to describe a little bit about what I mean by a social emotional learning intervention. So there's a group that's Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning at University of Illinois, Chicago. And they have they're sort of almost like a clearinghouse for these different social and emotional learning interventions. And these are sort of packaged interventions that teachers can use in schools to teach kids a set of social and self-regulatory skills. And so they have described these skills as really these key skills that kids need to know as social and emotional skills. So self-management, things like self-control, and taking turns when you're talking, self-awareness, being aware when you're feeling a certain emotion and knowing how to regulate that emotion. So even if you want to hit someone, you know how to calm yourself down so you don't hit somebody. Social awareness, being aware of other people's emotions, and being aware of your, when you say something, how do people respond to that? How are they likely to respond? Relationship skills, how do you get along with other people? Are you pro-social and can you cooperate? Can you take turns? And then the last one is this responsible decision making. And the idea with responsible decision making is that there are a lot of situations where kids have to make decisions and there are trade-offs. There's social situations where they need to do things. And there's a set of decision making skills that are challenging to learn, but yet very important as a capacity for kids to be able to have. So there's a whole boatload of interventions that are designed to develop these skills. The one that I'm going to, I'll tell you a little bit about the research on these kind of interventions. So there's been some meta-analytic work. Recently, Joe Gerlach and Roger Weisberg and colleagues put together a meta-analysis of 113 studies of social and emotional learning interventions. And what they find is they find that the use of these interventions relates to some gains in social emotional skills, cooperation, and assertion, for example, and also a boost in achievement, a small boost in achievement. Now, one of the things about this meta-analysis is that the meta-analyses are only as good as the papers in them, and many of the papers in them are intervention studies, but they are not designed in a way that would warrant a causal inference. So also in relation to the current state of SEL research, there are a few studies that have been done, randomized controlled trials of social and emotional learning interventions. The first one that comes to mind is one that was done by Victor Batistich on the Developmental Studies Center, and it was really really elegant randomized controlled trial that was done probably 20 years ago, where and they really found that the effectiveness of the intervention really hinged on the actual implementation of the intervention. And it was really focused, that intervention is focused on creating kids' sense of bonding towards school and feeling of closeness towards school. There's one on 4Rs that's been done more recently, and their findings suggest that they're a little bit stronger for kids who are more at risk, but the findings are not, I don't think they're incredibly, they're not particularly strong. There's been some efforts to make the intervention more potent. And positive action is another one where there's been a nice sized randomized controlled trial. There was through IES, there was in about 2002, there was a whole set of social and character development projects, and so they did a multi-site, multi-intervention study on what they called moral and character development. And then they gathered some of the common measures across a number of social and emotional learning interventions. What was interesting is they had a difficulty aligning the outcomes with the interventions themselves. The findings from there really suggest it all hinges on implementation, and also the findings from their final report are much weaker than the other empirical studies that come out of this, the same work with its own data. So I think that there's some work that suggests, I think the meta-analysis sort of gives us a state of where the field is at, and we could expect sort of small to moderate gains in kids' achievement or social skills, but the research is still fairly new in terms of work done with more rigorous approaches. Okay, so there's a few reasons to avoid social and emotional learning interventions. It's always good to be skeptical about your own work. One thing that's really striking is if you look at state learning standards, for example, you see that something like 48 or 49 states have social and emotional learning standards for kids in preschool. There's only one state, Illinois, that has social and emotional learning standards for kids kindergarten through 12. And when you think about that, it seems like a pretty big omission. And that it seems like, well, why would that be the case? And I would say that really priorities really shift. And when you look at what's going on in classrooms now, and you see the amount of attention that's given to reading and math, and then like social studies gets this much attention in the class, or science, these subjects that get left behind. So you think so sometimes I think to myself, well, maybe there just isn't enough time or energy in a school day to be able to also have a set of standards around social and emotional learning. That might be one way to be skeptical. Another reason to be skeptical is that you can have lovely classrooms where everyone feels safe and even happy, but there may be no learning going on. And I think we've all seen classrooms like that, where we say, this is a lovely place to be, but kids are not going to walk out of there having learned anything. And there's some research that really kind of supports that idea that you really need academic press to make that happen. And the other thing is is that social skills don't automatically just cross over to improve academic skills. So Greg Duncan and colleagues did a really nice meta-analysis using 6 different data sets and sort of looking at, like, if you have better social skills, are you more likely to also have better academic skills? Or, early social skills, do they predict later academic skills? And the answer is no, not if you look at social skills. If you look at attentional skills, that's where you see some of the action. But just social skills alone, being able to be cooperative, you don't really see that crossover effect. So there are some trade-offs. So there's reasons to be skeptical of these types of interventions. So the intervention that I chose to study is this intervention called responsive classroom. And I'm going to describe it a little bit. So one of the things I always hate is when people are talking about an intervention and halfway through you realize you don't know what the intervention is. So I'm going to make sure that I'm clear about what the intervention actually is. So this was developed by a group of people in Western Mass in the 1980s. It's designed as an approach to educators creating safe, challenging, and joyful elementary school classrooms. I'm independent from them, and they're a nonprofit organization. They generate a lot of books and materials for teachers, and they're very careful to keep their eyes on what teachers' needs are and develop materials in line with those teacher needs. So the way that the intervention is designed is they have a set of guiding principles. They have 7 principles that they say are really sort of important things for teachers to keep in mind in working with kids. So one example is the social curriculum is as important as the academic curriculum. Another is to be successful academically and socially. Children need a set of social skills, including cooperation, assertion, responsibility, empathy, and self-control. And then the process of learning is as important as the product of learning. So it's really designed to open up the process of learning and what occurs during that process of learning and how learning occurs. So the idea of having these principles is that it's really easy to tell teachers to do a set of things, but we've often seen teachers do a set of behaviors, but it's like they're not really kind of getting it. So these principles kind of help make the practices kind of make sense. And if I had to categorize these principles and describe them in kind of two broad themes, I would say one is that it's really focused on creating a caring environment in the classroom, a caring environment between teachers and kids and among kids, and then it's also very proactive about classroom management. So instead of waiting till kids mess things up or break things or need discipline, it's really focused on teaching the kids a set of social skills very proactively, or a set of skills about how to use materials very proactively before engaging in those skills. And the idea is that you do all this work up front, and so that things go much more smoothly towards the end of later in the class period, or later in the year. Okay, so here are a few of their practices. These are 10 of their practices, and I'll describe a couple of them. One of the ones that's the most common, but also commonly misused, I should point out, is the sort of the morning meeting. So every classroom starts with a morning meeting. Morning meetings are usually about 20 minutes, and the kids come in the morning, and there's a sign and a chart, and they can respond to the little note on the chart, and then the chart is interactive, and then they write something on the chart about the day. And the idea of that chart is to kind of engage them in learning, give them a little bit like, oh yeah, I remember you're at school, and it's a little bit of routine to it, but something to just help them make the transition between home and school. Then the kids gather for a morning meeting, and kids don't bring anything with them to the morning meeting. And they sit in a circle on the floor. Typically, the teacher sits at their level or in a low chair, and then they begin with a greeting. And a simple greeting is that each child greets another person. So I'll try it with Ken. Good morning, Ken. Good morning. And you'd say good morning, Sarah. Yes. Okay. Nicely done. We'll keep working on that, right? Yes. And so the easy greeting is you just go around the room like that, where I would say good morning to Ken. Ken would say good morning to me. And then you go around like that. And then the greetings can be much more interesting. So, maybe a month, a few days into a classroom, the teachers will teach, these train greetings where you get in, you create like a train, and then you greet the people as they come around the train. And there's the handshake greeting where they'll greet, everyone will greet each other, with the Mr. and Mrs. and their kid's last name. And they'll do a handshake greeting. They'll start with a handshake greeting, like, good morning, Ken, and then, and then they'll go to like the last name, like, good morning, Mr. I'm forgetting your last name, Mr. Shores, and so they'll go to that kind of greeting. But what you're seeing here is sort of like a building of these social skills, but you're also seeing an opportunity where every kid is greeted in the morning by name every single day. And there is something, to that idea of, that kind of theoretically, it makes sense that that's something that you would want to, build community. It would be a way to build community. So then after the greeting, they do an activity. The activities are usually designed just to be fun and to bring out the best in the kids and best in the teachers. And they do, usually it's a little bit about, has a little bit of academic work that's tied in. It's designed to really bring a spark to the day and learning. So sometimes like one that comes to mind right now is a word-ending soccer ball, where they'll have, in the white parts of the soccer ball, it'll have little word endings like dash, ing, and the kids, gently toss the soccer ball to each other, and they're taught how to do that carefully. And then they come up with a word that has that word ending. And it's just fun, and it's playful, and the kids enjoy it, and they laugh when the ball falls. There's all these different kinds of activities. They usually take about 5 minutes, and they're, the kids usually find them fun. And then the next part is sharing, and the sharing is what's called short and clear share, not breakfast to bed share. And a couple kids will volunteer in the morning to share, and they will say something very short about something that's happened. It's often related to the learning that they did. It's cued specifically by the teacher on that chart, and then it's often related to the learning, and then after the child says this, the child says, "I'm ready for questions and comments." And the kids are taught how to make comments that aren't about them. Because you can picture, so Johnny gets up there and says, "I have new shoes," and every kid wants to say, "I have new shoes too." But that's talking about them. They should really be talking about Johnny's new shoes. And so the kids are taught where you say, "Where did you get your new shoes? When did you get them? Are they comfortable?" And there are a few conversations, and then after 3 questions, the child will say, "I can take more questions or comments at recess or at lunch." And then that's the end. And so it's like just kind of like teaching, like, at some point the conversation ends, moving on. And so then the last piece is that they go through this announcement charts. And the announcements are, sometimes the teachers will write them with funny English and the kids correct the English, or sometimes they'll be just setting the stage for the day. But the idea is that the teacher would bring something up that creates curiosity about the day. And it creates this feeling of like, "Ooh, I wonder what's going to happen next for the kids." And that would be on that chart, and then the kids discuss that. That all takes about 20 minutes. I've seen 5-minute morning meetings, that you can do them very, very quickly if there's a need for that. And their teachers are taught ways to adapt them to be a regular part of the classroom day. So I'm going to also I'll give you another example of academic choice. Academic choice is when actually I'm going to give you the example of interactive modeling. So interactive modeling is when the teachers teach the kids a set of skills that they're going to need to be able to use to do their academic work. So if the kids are going to be choosing partners to work in working groups, and the kids have not chosen partners in their classroom before, what the teacher will do is the teacher will model, "Okay, I'm going to choose a partner, and I want you to watch and notice what I do." And the teacher will walk over, put a hand up, and choose a partner, and then they will sit down with that partner and will model that behavior. And then she'll ask the kids, "What did you notice about me doing that behavior?" And the kids will all say, "Well, you chose someone that you don't usually work with. You chose someone quietly. You chose someone by putting your hand up." They'll all talk about what they noticed. And then they'll say, "Okay, I'd like someone else to try it." And then one of the kids will do it. And they'll do the same thing. And then we'll say, "Okay, what did you notice?" "Okay, good. So what are the things?" "Okay, now I want all of you to try it." And so it's practicing these behaviors again and again like this, or just like this, so that they become routine. And so then the next day when the teacher says, "Okay, I want you to find a partner," then she'll probably say, "Can someone remind me what we need to do to find a partner?" And somebody will remind them how to find a partner, and then they'll go and find a partner, and then they'll all go to find a partner. Now the third time they do it, the teacher will just say, "Let's go find a partner," and the kids will all know how to do it. And it's I've seen this, and it is quite efficient. It appears to work. When I watch this happen, I say, there is some, this is quite a way, boy, I wish I'd known this when my kids were little. But it is quite a way to manage a group of kids very, in a way that looks very, very smooth. Okay, so those are the few examples. Okay, so here's our conceptual logic model for the work. And so we start with our intervention components. We had training and coaching in responsive classroom, which I'll describe more closely. we expected that would lead to a change in their teaching practices and the use of these responsive classroom practices in school. And then there were a whole set of proximal and distal outcomes. One was improved quality of the classroom environment, better teacher-student interactions. That was one. Then I expected that would result in improved student engagement and learning, and ultimately I would expect this would relate to improved social skills and improved achievement. So now in creating this logic model, the things that I was really very interested and curious about were these proximal outcomes, because I really am interested in knowing what happens in classrooms. So that was a big part of, that was a really expanded part of the work. And then we measured use of RC practices with a lot of careful detail, which I'll describe. Okay, so I'm going to describe the study itself. It was a Goal 3 efficacy trial funded by IES through teacher quality math. At the time, they didn't have any. They didn't have a program around behavioral research, and it was a randomized control trial of 24 elementary schools in a large Mid-Atlantic district. So here's a description of the school characteristics for the intervention and control conditions. And so we randomized on free and reduced price lunch, the ethnic composition of the classroom, of the schools, and also the presence of English language learners. And after we randomized, we did a baseline achievement test, and fortunately there were no differences between the intervention and control samples. So we randomized at the school level, which is always a challenge, because instantly we had N of 24, and we are feeling underpowered right from the get-go. Now you'll notice that the intervention group has 13 and control has 11, and you might be wondering about that. So the district that we were working with had a policy in place that all schools needed to adopt an intervention, either PBIS or responsive classroom. And some of them had not gotten around to doing this yet. And there were exactly 24 schools who had not gotten around to doing this yet. And so they all were interested in this study because they were going to either get responsive classroom training right away, or we're going to be on a wait list for responsive classroom, and we're going to be able to get it right when the study was over. And so in doing the randomization, we first did the randomization, and then what we discovered is that 2 of the schools in the control condition had had some exposure to responsive classroom. Not high levels, but some. So what we did is we randomized those 2 and put one in the intervention group and kept one in the control group. And so that was why we had this uneven end. I used to be worried about that, but I've gotten over it. So when we look at the composition as a whole, this is what our sample looks like. It was a very ethnically diverse sample because of the nature of the district with a lot of immigrants. Everything we sent home to families had to be automatically translated into 7 home languages. And it was about 1/3 of kids receiving free and reduced lunch. And that was our best indicator of poverty, which I know is imperfect. But okay, so I'm going to describe the data that we collected. So we had schools, 24 schools, randomized condition here. And then we had, what we did is I'm going to skip over to the students. We had 2,900 students. We had baseline achievement in the spring of 2nd grade, and then we followed those students to the end of 5th grade. And we had achievement each year between 2nd grade and 5th grade. When the kids were in 3rd grade, we observed their 3rd grade teachers. When the kids were in 4th grade, we observed their 4th grade teachers. And when the kids were in 5th grade, we observed their 5th grade teachers. So we followed this. So if you think about it from a kid's perspective, a kid happened to be going to a school and who happened to be enrolled in this study and were randomized into either intervention or control condition. If they stayed in that school for that whole period of time, they either received responsive classroom or didn't. And then we studied that child and his or her teachers for those 3 years. Okay, so we are plagued with massive amounts of attrition, which always poses a challenge in any study, but particularly a 3-year longitudinal study. And you can see here just the number of students exiting and entering our sample. And because the randomization is at the school level, we ended up modeling considering this attrition in our modeling in our missing data approach, which I'll talk about. Okay, so we did these observations. So what we did is we did these 5 one-hour classroom observations. We did 2 in the morning, and we did 2 during math, and we did live coding of responsive classroom practices. And then we also did teacher surveys. Every spring we'd survey the teachers, and then we also gathered all these student test scores in the May of each year. And these are my tapes. They were collected on videotape and then put in these envelopes, and when I'm feeling sort of glum, I go and look at my tape closet, because I mean, this is just an impressive amount of classrooms. And so all of, it's a little retro that they're on tapes and not digital, but there's something very concrete about it. But we do have, thousands of hours of videotape of math teachers and, of 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade teachers. And we often dig back in there to try to understand findings. Okay, enough of that. Okay, so our intervention group, they got their responsive classroom training from Northeast Foundation for Children. The training is rigorous. It takes a long time. It was 35 hours, now it's reduced to 30 hours, but it's 35 hours one summer, then you go back the next summer and you do another 35 hours. So this is about changing teachers' habits. And anyone who's tried to change habits knows it's not easy to change habits. And so it's a very intensive training. Then there's follow-up of an on-site training, coaching, and workshops. There's books and materials online that the schools were given and the teachers were given. And then also there's support for the principals at the intervention schools. And then the control group had business as usual. And we looked carefully at what their school-wide practices were. And then all of our fidelity measures we measured in both intervention and control conditions, so we can look at both carefully. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about fidelity, because that's really where the rubber hits the road. So it's one thing to train teachers in something, and it's another to do something. And I always think, like, well, I joined Weight Watchers, but I never went. How come I didn't lose weight? That's the kind of thing where frequently with these kind of interventions, you can go to a week-long training, but it's another thing, like, do you actually use it? And that's the real challenge. So I'm going to talk about 3 types of fidelity: compliance with random assignment status, engagement and participation in the training, and then the third one, which is actual use of the practices in the classroom. Okay, so compliance with random assignment, we had a pretty incredible district with a vision, and so we had a very high compliance. We had 96%. I think that's pretty high. For a week during the summer for teachers, 2 weeks during the summer for teachers, that strikes me as very high compliance. So the blue bars on the top are the number assigned to the intervention condition, and then the light blue bars underneath are the number of teachers who actually attended if they were assigned to. And then in our control group, none of the teachers in our control group reported having training during the period of the study. Okay. Another type of fidelity would be the trainer's ratings of teachers in the RC training. And so we had the consulting teacher, the person running the training, we had them do a questionnaire on each of the teachers at the end of the week. And so first of all, the first question is about attendance and full attendance. And what you can see here is that it was on a rating scale from 1 to 5, and that the teachers generally showed very, very high attendance. And then it means also like being on time for the, like, okay, we're going to meet back up at 10. Kind of thing. And then here's engagement, interest, and openness to ideas. And here we had quite a bit more variability. And actually, we have done a little bit of work to try to understand that variability and whether it predicts later use of intervention practices. But in general, the levels are about, on average, about 4. You can also see, and these are not statistically significant differences, but I notice these. I wonder if we were to look at kindergarten through 5, you can, by the time 5th grade teachers often have their priorities. And I wonder, when I see that kind of dip, I wonder if we would, if that would manifest itself more broadly if we had the full range of grades. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about our fidelity of implementation measures. So what we did is we used a lot of the fidelity literature as our way of kind of guiding our path on this. And we really wanted to get at not just how often you do a morning meeting, but whether you're doing a morning meeting in a way that's consistent and high quality. And so, as an example. And so there's a big difference between doing it and doing it with quality. And so we really worked hard in developing these measures. All of these measures were homegrown, and done in collaboration with the developers of the intervention. So the first one, Fidelity of Implementation, we call it an adherence measure, was a teacher practices survey. And that was teachers rating their behaviors, 46 different behaviors that they might use in the classroom. And the way that the wording was done in a way that you could be not a responsive classroom teacher, but you would still might be able to rate the behavior as high. And so, for example, it would be something like, I use hand signals regularly, and I use hand signals in my classroom to get kids' attention. So it'd be something like that. That's a responsive classroom, that's integrated into responsive classroom practices, but it's also something that just a regular old teacher might do. Or I give children choice in an activity that they're going to be doing, a learning activity that they're going to be doing. So it's a responsive classroom practice, but it's also, a good teacher might do that. Then we looked at exposure, so the classroom practice frequency survey, how often do you do morning meeting, how often do you do interactive modeling, and then a Fidelity of Implementation adherence, which was the CPOM, classroom practice observational measure, and that we did live coding in the classroom, looking for these, we had 16 different behaviors that we would look at to see that they occurred. And these were behaviors that could be done in both an intervention or control condition. And I really like this work by Kodra and Pion because it kind of has really helped me think about fidelity. So when you implement an intervention, ideally you want your treatment strength somewhere around 100. But not everyone who's getting the treatment is actually going to implement the practices. So they're really going to be more around here. And then when you are implementing something like responsive classroom, there are going to be some people in the control condition who use some of these practices just because they're similar enough to just good old practices. And so your control condition isn't completely clean. So where in an ideal world, you'd be operating up here and you'd have this kind of treatment and you'd be expecting this kind of outcome, way up here, but in the real world, you're actually operating down here. And in the same way, with the control condition, you'd expect that you'd be operating down here at 0, but we live in the real world, and there's contamination, there's all kinds of things that can, or there's just plain old good practices. Some of the control teachers are going to be using some of these practices. So along those lines, I can show you what the control and the intervention groups look like on these measures. And what you can see here is these, so this is baseline 3rd grade followed by study year 3rd grade, baseline 4th grade, study year 4th grade, baseline 5th grade, and study year 5th grade. And what you can see is that in each case, there was no difference between control and intervention in the use of these practices, or the teacher's report of use of practices in the baseline year, but there was a difference in the intervention year. Okay, and then we also had this teacher survey of the frequency of practices over here. And so that we didn't have baseline data on these, on the frequency measure, and I didn't put any stats in here, but all of these show that the intervention and control condition are quite different. So that was a very clear finding, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And then here we have observed fidelity, and we see the difference between intervention and control. Does training in responsive classroom produce change in teacher practices? That you can't, that's the first question to ask. And we did see a very dramatic difference. So what we did is we took those different measures of implementation, the two teacher reported measure and the observed measure, put them together in a factor score, and then compared intervention and control. This is school level. And you can see this is a pretty dramatic difference between intervention and control conditions. That was the first question. But and this is also, we can make a causal inference here. Training impacted teacher practice. Okay. So moving on to question 2. The other ones aren't quite so short. So the second question would be, does training in responsive classroom produce change in student achievement over 3 years? So this was the question that a lot of people wanted to know the answer to. And so I'm going to describe our analytic approach. So we use a structural equation modeling approach to do this. And this was done in M+, and we used maximum likelihood techniques. And it was a 2-level, for this analysis, we used a 2-level model. So schools and students. And so what that meant is we ended up compositing across all of the fidelity scores across the teachers for 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade in this model. And then we have separate analyses for math and reading. We tried to do them together first. That didn't work. It didn't converge, and we moved to separate analyses for math and reading. And we had there was a few specific data issues that we dealt with. For missing data, we figured out that it was missing at random, and we used full information maximum likelihood to maintain the power. And then we also had considerable ceiling effects, especially in math. And so what we did here is we used a censored data technique, which is sort of comparable to coming up with like a latent variable is a way of handling the number of ceiling effects. So a couple of the key independent and dependent variables, intervention control, and then we also, for some of the analyses, used Fidelity, which I'll describe. And our outcome measures were basically the, I will say the, sorry this is going on video, but the rather crummy assessment that is used, the state assessment that was used at the end of the year. And the reason I say crummy is that I would have liked a much more rich math assessment that would have really gotten at sort of more of the nuances of what was, what kids were actually learning. So I don't really know whether they're really learning the mathematical concepts in the way that I would really want to assess. But then what we had is some school level covariates, the teacher's level of teaching experience, the number with master's degrees, the free and reduced price lunch at the school, and also their kids' initial achievement. And then we also entered some of those in as child level covariates also. And we had also gender, free and reduced price lunch, English language learner status, plain English test. Some of the kids who are English language learners used an adapted form of the test. And then also initial achievement. So this was a Stanford 10 that we administered in 2nd grade. And so in all of these analyses, what we found is that the basic answer to does responsive classroom training predict achievement, the answer was pretty much no, not at all. We got, anything that there were no significant direct effects that we detected in these analyses, and the answer was basically just, training alone did not produce achievement gains. Of course, there's more to the story. I did say this is like the confirmatory part. Now I'm going to do the just observational work. Okay, so now we're leaving the zone of causal inference. So everybody just hold on, just get ready. We're going to leave the zone, okay? Is everyone okay? We're good? Okay, good. Just want to make sure. Okay, so let's talk about these indirect effects. So this is kind of, sort of what was going on. That's sort of doesn't make clear what's really, really going on. So we asked, to what degree does teachers' use of responsive classroom practices mediate the relation between assignment to the RC condition and 5th grade achievement? So the point here is we had all those data, my little tape closet, we have all these data on what's going on inside the classroom. And we have teachers' reports, so we can look at all that and say, does that matter? Does it matter if teachers actually use the practices? And so we ran that same, the same structural equation model that I described before. We ran that same model, but added these fidelity components in at the school level. And so here's what we found. So what we had here is we have a direct effect. So this is a mediation model. And so we have this direct effect. We have this causal effect here. This is the same thing as the fidelity effect, that training produced change in RC practices. And then we have this direct effect, which is a very curious thing. It's a negative direct effect. So basically, RC training reduced 5th grade achievement. But then we have this indirect effect, which is from RC to use of practices, and from use of practices to 5th grade achievement. And that indirect effect was 0.45. And so then you end up with what's your total effect. So your total effect is your direct effect plus your indirect effect. And basically that's pretty small. And it's like not a significant outcome. So if you look just at the indirect effect, you do see, wow, those teachers who were assigned to RC and use RC practices showed gains in 5th grade achievement. Remember, no causal inference there. But when you look at the total effect overall, you see nothing. And so I was talking with Sean this morning. What is it you say to teachers or to teachers or principals when they ask you a question like, should I use responsive classroom or not? And Sean pointed out, well, you should say, don't be a low implementer. I mean, that was essentially like you don't want to be a low implementer. And that's really the message. The message here is that there's a lot of variability in implementation. And so when you see that much variability in implementation, you see you can end up seeing these kind of indirect effects emerge. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a product of that variability. I'm shocked. There must be a question, because I'm getting that sense of, no, I'll just keep moving.
I'll ask a question. I've forgotten whether we were allowed to ask questions.
Clarification questions.
Oh, is that right? So
Yes.
I wanted to press on the issue of giving that advice to schools, because in some sense you've left the zone of causal inference, and in the zone of causal inference, treatment moved the theorized mediators, but that had no effect on outcomes. So why are you comfortable giving that prescriptive advice with more observational methods?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, this is something I wrestle with, because I don't just say, go get it. And I balance it very carefully with, you have to realize that just getting training is not going to, you need to make sure that the practices are actually going to have this level of uptake. We did some qualitative work to see what would predict this variable level of uptake. And we found certain school conditions were really important. So, for example, some schools some schools wanted responsive. It's like another thing to put on their website. And the principals are like, yeah, we're a responsive classroom school, and we're also this and this and this and this. Well, when we talked to those teachers, they sort of felt like, well, I don't feel psychologically safe to make a change right now. I don't feel like I'm being supported by my principal. I feel like the principal's just doing this because they want to be a responsive classroom school, but I don't really feel like we're really into it as a group. And you see a lot of these kind of psychological experiences of teachers that suggest to me that the implementation is not really going to take off. So unless a school, and this is totally, I should not say anything about, because since I don't have causal inference, I shouldn't say anything. But on the other hand, if anyone can say anything, it should be me, because I've been studying this for long enough to kind of have a gut sense. That's what I kind of think. So I say, if you're going to be a low implementing school for any reason, you do not want this. This is not something you should do. You should think very carefully and very strategically about your priorities and what other things that you're doing, and see if the teachers at your school are really ready for a deep level change in their practice. Now, I haven't tested that, so I don't know whether it would work. I would love to test that. Great.
I have two questions, I guess. One is, do you have any data on students' enjoyment of school or their relationships with one another, their teachers, and do you see direct effects on that? That's one question. And then the second question is, can you help us understand theoretically why a low implementer school might be negative as compared to business as usual?
Yeah.
Because they're two different.
So the first question, and I will, I'll probably go into the first question a little bit more afterwards, but we did look at feelings about school and kids' social skills, but only in 5th grade, and there were no direct effects, nothing.
You get the same indirect effect?
No, we don't get an indirect effect either. We do get an indirect effect for closer teacher-child relationships.
From the students' reports?
No, from the teacher report. But the student report, there was nothing, and we looked very hard, nothing. So then the second question was, what was the second question? Oh, the theory. Why is it going negative?
Yeah.
I have a theory about that, just from watching these classrooms, that when you're learning something new as a teacher, it takes a little while to learn, and sometimes you end up giving up things that were actually quite productive in your classroom. And so I could see teachers wrestling with the new way of using language, and it sounded very awkward. And I think there are times when teachers are using it instead of other things they used to do. There could be a nice thing to do would be to do some sort of longitudinal work on the teachers to really unpack that.
I have a very simple clarification.
Yeah.
What's the ceiling effect?
A ceiling effect is when the math scores, when a lot of the kids were at 600, and 600 is the maximum score. So it's like 20% of our kids were at the 600 mark, and that's too many. It causes a problem for measurement. Yes, Susanna?
So I'm not in my mind is not working very well for how this is estimated. So it could be kind of a totally wrong question. But how separate are these different parts? So if you just have teachers who naturally do these practices are better teachers in multiple dimensions, and so you get a positive relationship with achievement. But the kind of the changes that came from the training didn't really lead to those positive things. Would that still show that those relationships still show up, so that the training affected the things you observed, but that increase didn't affect fifth grade achievement? Is the effect of RC practices on fifth grade achievement only from the RC practices that were increased because of the training?
There could be something about those teachers that showed high uptake that made them better teachers, and that's that made them better teachers in the first place, and that would also explain this finding. Did that answer your question?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Set up clarification questions about the timelines. So were all of is this all about the same class of students who were in second grade and worked their way through, but all of the third, fourth, and fifth grade teachers got trained as well?
So the third grade teachers got trained first. They only got 1 year of training because the study needed to start. Then the fourth grade teachers got trained with the third grade, and then they got their second year. So all the teachers had gotten, and then the fifth grade got trained one summer, then the following summer. All the teachers got trained. They had 2 years of training before being observed, whereas the third grade teachers only had 1 year. They only had 1 year of training, and then they were observed.
And is there any possibility of getting follow-up data about later classes of students?
Yeah, I would.
Or experience?
Oh, your other question was about the students. Yeah, I would like to follow these kids, ideally. That's something that's been in my mind, especially as they're about to, like through middle school, and then when they go to high school, I'd like 9th grade scores on them. It's one of the things I'm hoping to do. And then I could even try, if the district were willing to give me the data, to try to unpack, take Fidelity down to the kid level. So for each kid, they get a dose. What's their dose that they got for 3 years? That would be really cool. I'd like to do that. Okay, so here's the same thing, same pattern for reading achievement, and you see the same trend where you get this, indirect effect. You get, a negative direct effect. You get a positive indirect effect, and you get 0 total effect. Mm-hmm.
Can I try asking that
Yes.
one more time?
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not like an interaction. It's not like the effect of the program for high uptake
No,
teachers
this is
versus
like-
low uptake teachers.
No,
Is
that
that-
would be moderation.
That would be kind of fun to see.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll have some other fun
Okay.
things.
Okay. Yeah.
We have more fun coming. Let's see what time it is. Okay, good. There's time for fun. Okay, so some summaries from research questions 1, 2, and 3. That random assignment to the RC condition predicted use of practices, and in turn, use of practices was associated with achievement, but that total effect is not present, and that that there was no total effect of RC on achievement. So, what's really occurring in the classroom? This is something that I've wanted to know. So I have 2 papers that I wanted to describe here, and I'm going to describe them fairly quickly because now you know the whole methods, the landscape all laid out. You're probably ready to analyze data. Who wants to come back with me to Charlottesville? Okay, so the first one is about critical ingredients of the responsive classroom approach and their relation to achievement. And the second one is about how responsive classroom combines with standards-based math and relates to achievement. Now, just as a warning, this is all exploratory. Okay, so here we focused on 4th grade participants. So one of the things that we learned is that we saw more teacher level variation in the 4th grade compared to the 3rd and 5th grade. And so we ended up doing quite a few of these additional analyses on the 4th grade kids and teachers. So this was our sample of 4th grade teachers and 4th grade kids. And for all of these analyses where we're looking at achievement, we control for 3rd grade achievement and predicting 4th grade achievement. So, this next question is about RC combined with standards-based math, predicting improved achievement. So we had 2 ways of looking. We looked at random assignment to responsive classroom, and we looked at use of RC practices using our Fidelity measures. And then use of standards-based math wasn't experimentally manipulated. What we did is we looked at all of the measures that existed at the time and found we wished that we found one that we liked, but we didn't, and so we developed a measure that we call the M-Scan that is, it's like a 7-point rating scale on 9 different dimensions, looking at the extent to which teachers are using standards-based math. And then we did very rigorous work to make sure that the measure had validity and also that we could use the measure reliably. Okay, so here's what the M-Scan measure focused on, and I'm going to describe sort of 4 broad categories of behavior. One is this mathematical coherence, and that had to do with the structure of the mathematical task. Was it a traditional versus more a standards-based math task, and was it coherent, and did it promote deeper understanding? So one thing we would often see in math classrooms is they would start out great with these great tasks, and then whoop, it would drop off, and it really didn't get into the mathematical problem solving in a very deep way. And then that also looked at mathematical accuracy. So that was in mathematical coherence. We had mathematical discourse, which is about students talking about the mathematical ideas. And so in some classrooms you see students are doing most of the talking in that. And in other classrooms you see teachers are doing more, most of the talking. And so in a standards-based math classroom you'd expect to see more student talk. Then you also see explanation and justification for answers. So a big part of the standards-based math is that students justify their reasoning. So teachers would say, well, why does it work that way? And they would write about their explanation for why they got the answer that they did. Okay, the next one is mathematical representations. This is using multiple representations of a mathematical idea and translating back and forth between these different representations. And also use of mathematical tools to represent mathematical concepts. So these are those Cuisenaire rods, for example. And are you using them, but are also you using them in a way that really connects to the math? So it's one thing to use a bunch of objects, but it's another way to use them in a way that really represents the math effectively. And then the last one is this task selection and enactment. So this gets at cognitive depth. So there's this deep conceptual connection, problem solving, that there's more than one way to solve a problem, and then connections and applications. So there's a meaningful connection to math in the student's broader world, so that the math has some meaning to the kids. And then here's our analytic approach here. That our outcome was 4th grade achievement, our predictors are intervention control and fidelity of implementation. We had a host of teacher level covariates, including the math teaching efficacy, and in a few different forms, and also the emotional support and classroom organization present in the classroom. And then we had some child level covariates, including 3rd grade achievement, which accounted for most of the variance. And this was also an M+, as a 2-level model, so we have teachers and students, and we use this 2-level complex to acknowledge that these teachers are also nested in schools. And then we used FIML to handle the missing data, and also we accounted for our ceiling effects in the same way as before with censored variables. And so here's what we learned. This was pretty fun to find out, because we didn't find, so we're predicting student achievement in 4th grade. So we didn't find that being assigned to the RC condition didn't predict student achievement, nor did fidelity. And use of discourse, lots of mathematical discourse in the classroom, didn't predict achievement. But we did see a combination. And so we did see this interaction effect. And we saw that both when randomly assigned to RC versus control, and we saw it when we used our fidelity measure. And this is what it looks like. And this effect size here is about 0.2 in achievement, which in social and emotional learning world is something that we, it's not a math intervention, so that's a striking thing. And this sort of suggests that hypothesis of, putting RC together with the standards-based math is actually producing an achievement gain. What's interesting here is that you also see this as a disordinal interaction. So if you're a control teacher and if you're an RC teacher and you're using more traditional mathematics, you're actually seeing a bit of a decrease in the achievement under what you would get if you were in a control classroom. So this is the same thing for task selection and enactment. And again, there's no main effects of RC, no main effects of task selection and enactment, but you see this interaction. in with both RC assignment and use of RC practices. As I'm seeing this, I'm getting very excited because I'm right in the middle of writing this paper. It's always good to talk about the work when you're writing it. And so, here's, again, this is a disorderal interaction, and both of these sides are significant. These differences are significant. And then we get to coherence, the mathematical coherence. And again, there's nothing here for RC assignment, nothing for RC practices, and nothing for test selection or enactment. But then we see this interaction effect that's present in both approaches. And here's this familiar disorderal. This side is not significant. This side is. Yeah. Okay. And so the answer to the question, does RC combined with standards-based math practice relate to increased achievement, is that for 3 of the 4 aspects of math, standards-based math practice, we did see this finding present. And then for, did we find it in both models? We saw it for 2 of the 4 that we tested. Okay, any questions about this?
So, what's your theory about why you have this negative effect in the less standards-based classroom?
Yeah. I have a couple theories. One possibility is that in these RC classrooms where they're using more traditional mathematics, that the kids have more capacity to kind of do more and do more complicated mathematical interactions, and they're getting a very didactic type of instruction that's very teacher-led. So that maybe during the rest of their day, they're doing things that involve more autonomy and more choice. And then they get to math and they're getting this very didactic approach that allows for less autonomy. So that's one possibility. It's sort of like they've been queued up for the rest of the day. They have these skills, they have these, they're ready to use them, and they're not really being afforded that opportunity. That's sort of one possibility. The other possibility that comes to mind is it just came to mind and went away. I'll let you know. The second possibility. You do have a possibility.
I do actually. So in research more on adult learners, but inspired by preparation for future learning, there's maybe the idea that you can change your instruction where they're both outcomes, sort of the immediate good scores on a cruddy state test versus preparation for future learning and maybe deeper learning. So do you think if you had a less cruddy state test, you would be getting different outcomes? I mean, of course, if you believe in this thing, the answer is probably yes. But.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. But it would be a really interesting thing to test, and it could be quite possible. That's some of what we're getting at.
Does doing these practices take time away from math?
We actually looked at that. We looked at how much time the RC and control schools spent in math in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. So we spent all this time aggregating the data and getting it ready. No difference. So, yeah.
So much for that.
Yeah. But I'm so glad you asked, because now I can tell you about it. I'm so glad we did that.
It's a great result.
So, were the teachers choosing whether or not to implement standards-based math, or was the school making the decision and the teachers followed suit?
So it's interesting because this school at the time, so Virginia, I'm coming clean, this was all done in Virginia, but we actually we've always had our own kind of independent way, and we haven't even bought into the standards. So we don't even use Common Core in Virginia. So this particular district, they use sort of a state set of, like a set of state guidelines. And sometimes when you ask the principal, what is your math curriculum? They say these state guidelines, which I was very shocked by. But what it means is that teachers had quite a bit of opportunity to choose from among a variety of different approaches. And that's why we realized we couldn't just say, what curriculum are you using, and divide them into standards-based versus non-standards-based, that we really needed to look to see what was actually going on in the classroom.
And I guess as a follow-up, if the teachers were self-selecting to do this sort of standards-based math model, and then we see that those teachers that are implementing it were also assigned to the RC are the ones that are having the positive effects? Is it possible that the reason that they're good at implementing RC is because they're just better teachers because they're more inclined to like implement a newer math form or something like that?
So that theory would hold, except we got this with the randomized. If they were randomized into the intervention group, this finding was also true. So if it wasn't the case, then that would be a possible explanation. Yeah. Okay. So the last research question, and this is also exploratory in nature, but I really wanted to know about these critical ingredients because good teaching does not belong to an intervention. It's not like an intervention owns an academic choice or owns interactive modeling or morning meeting. It's a set of practices, and you can just go and use these practices. Yes, the training appears to be very effective in producing the use of those practices, but I was sort of curious, well, what aspects of responsive classroom are or aren't working? And can we kind of decouple what's going on and really understand what's going on? So I had this very ambitious student, Tasha Avery, who was interested in taking on this role. And what she did, which I thought was really cool, is she looked at the measures that we had and use those fidelity measures to identify critical ingredients of responsive classroom. Okay, so looking at our measures, there were four practices where we felt like we got a really good read on these measures. So what that meant is we had items from all three types of fidelity that would actually measure these practices, and that they had some face validity when we looked at how these composites were built, and we ended up with these four. And this was how so these were the measures that we used, and I mentioned these before: the observed measure, the teacher-reported measure, and also the teacher-reported frequency scale. And then, we call this the standard approach. So what we did is we created measure-based composites where we just took all the CPOM items, added them up, and found a mean for all the CPOM items for a teacher. So a teacher would have a CPOM score, a teacher would have a CPTS score, a teacher would have a CPFS score. So that's the measure-based composite, the standard way of doing that. Then we did the novel approach, which we call our practice-based composites. And what those look like conceptually is in the morning meeting, for the morning meeting practice, we have morning meeting items from these three measures. For rule creation, we have RC items, we have rule creation items from these three measures. Interactive modeling items from these three measures. Academic choice items from these three measures. And I'll show you how we got these. So she did this multi-trait, multi-method framework where what you do is it's a type of structural equation modeling where she put in the various measures as well as the various practices and ran this model until she had a model that was a very, very good fit. And then these were the items that would load onto these various practices from these different measures. Okay, so this was the first thing that we did, that we discovered that was just so cool. So when we use the standard approach, the measure-based approach, you can see that all these three different measures are really highly correlated to each other. So our frequency measure is really highly correlated with our teacher report survey of the quality. Our observed measure is really highly correlated with the teacher survey. And our frequency survey is really highly correlated with the observed measure. These are really pretty high correlations. That's the standard approach. Then when we looked at the novel approach, we discovered something, in that these correlations were a lot lower than what I thought. So that means there's a lot of heterogeneity. So some teachers use morning meeting, but they don't really use that much academic choice. Or they use rule creation, but they don't really use that much morning meeting. So what we discovered from that is that teachers are being selective about which practices they're using, and they're not using them very evenly. And so even though we see it in some places some fairly low correlations, or moderate correlations, we're not seeing them nearly as high as we're seeing them here. And so a responsive classroom teacher can look very different. The other thing is we see these correlations are the same in the intervention condition and the control condition. Not identical, but basically you see these same patterns. So if a teacher's in the control condition, they've never received training in responsive classroom, but some of these practices tend to kind of co-occur. in these uneven ways. Okay, so then Tasha took these two types of measures, and she looked to see how they predicted the achievement, fourth grade achievement. And so here's the traditional approach, the standard approach, and you can see here that none of the regular Fidelity measures predicted reading, but we did see that the teacher report, the 46-item teacher report measure, did predict fourth grade math, controlling for a whole series of covariates, including third grade achievement. And then she did the same thing with this novel approach, these practices. And what she found here is that in reading, morning meeting, rule creation, and interactive modeling didn't relate to achievement, but academic choice did. And the same thing with math, in that the math, that there was nothing for morning meeting, there was nothing for, and if anything, look how close, that's quite negative, and it's a pretty large beta there. And then we have rule creation, nothing here, and then we do see it for academic choice. So there's something special about this academic choice that was going on. The other cool thing about this is that when she compared the models and looked at the classroom level variance explained by these models, that this model, the novel approach to practice-based composite, actually accounted for more of the overall level of classroom level variance than the more traditional model. So it seems like we happened across something that's actually kind of a different way of looking at the data that actually was a more productive way. So this is an exploratory question that opens up the possibility that there's something really potent about the academic choice. And there's a small study that needs to be done where we just randomize teachers into academic choice versus non-academic choice and see what the achievement gains are as a product of that. That's like a little small, tidy study that comes from this. And it's also kind of interesting to me that this model, even though it has overall less items, actually accounted for more of the total level of classroom level variance. Okay, so what we did, and we also found that those findings were comparable for intervention and control schools, which is also somewhat surprising. So we see those, it's about using the practices, and that's why I have a duck here. That if you talk like a duck and you walk like a duck, you are a duck. So if you use a lot of responsive classroom practices, you actually are a responsive classroom teacher. I mean, you're going to get the same outcomes whether you were trained in the practices or not. Okay, and so we saw an unevenness in the use of different RC practices, and then academic choice being associated with higher achievement. So the question of can we find professional development models that set the stage for inquiry-based math instruction? I don't have a yes or no answer to this. I do think that there's some signal here that we're seeing that suggests that there need to be some skills in place, that there needs to be some capacity in place for teachers to be able to use standards-based math, and there is something synergistic happening here. But I wouldn't, I certainly can't say go get responsive classroom coming out of this work overall. So here's the review of these 5 questions, and I think, did responsive classroom in RC produce change? Yes. Is there effect of RC on achievement? No. To what extent does fidelity of implementation mediate the relationship between RC and achievement? Well, there's an indirect effect, but not a total effect. Do standards-based math and RC combined contribute to enhance achievement to some degree? And can we identify critical ingredients of responsive classroom? Yes, this academic choice is really interesting to me. And so I'm ready for conversation and comments.
Can you remind us what academic choice involves?
Yes, absolutely. So the academic choice is a few different components. So the first, what it is the teacher chooses the learning objective. Fits very well with differentiated instruction, where the teacher chooses a learning objective, and then the kids either sign up to use, they can meet that learning objective in a variety of different ways, and the teacher usually orients the kids. You can practice your spelling words on the computer. You can practice your spelling words on the whiteboard. You can practice your spelling words at your desk writing, or something more involved, like you can read this book and write, a letter from the perspective of the protagonist in the book, or you can read this book and you can design a travel brochure to this area, you know, or you know, this, and you can do a web search on such and such. So there are different ways they engage in the activities, and then before doing that activities, the kids sign up for which activities they're going to do. So there's something planful that's very intentional about the child choosing the activity and saying, this is the activity I'm going to do. Then they go and they do the activity, and whatever the learning activity is, and at the end of the academic choice, they reflect either to a small group, like maybe to another student, or to the large group about either the content of what they did or how they did the work. So they do some sort of active reflection on that activity.
So they basically put skin in the game right in the beginning.
I think what it's involving is this planning portion, this actual getting some choice as to what you get to do, and then this metacognitive activity of reflecting afterwards.
Do you have any kind of baseline on the kinds of classrooms or students or schools to see any kinds of differential effects?
Yeah. So I'm so glad you asked, because I happen to have a slide.
I was fine.
Were you?
No, I wasn't. I'm just teasing. But I could have been.
That's funny. Okay, so we had this, we tested for moderated mediation, essentially. So this is that same structural equation modeling. Here's moderated mediation where we have initial achievement. And what we find is that the one place where we see differential effects are in low achieving students. So we see a higher indirect effect for those lower achieving students. And that is approaching 0.9. And so it's kids who in second grade were in the lowest 25 percentile on their Stanford 10 math that they showed a higher, a greater boost in their math. We also looked at this comparing free and reduced lunch and not free and reduced lunch and saw nothing. So it suggested that it was, you know, equivalently related to outcomes for both kids who were receiving free and reduced lunch and those who were not.
So Sarah, I'd like to come back to the policy prescriptive components of this, because I really like the effort the exploratory, non-causal effort to get under the hood and see which components matter and what kind of interactions and treatment moderators might be at play. But it felt as if you were walking away from sort of the main lead, I think, here, which is you had this intervention that created RC practices probably at least as well, if not substantially better, than it's done in most classrooms that are signing up for this program. And if I'm recollecting correctly, it generated a nearly 4 standard deviation shift in use of RC practices, but no effect on achievement. So shouldn't the top line result be it's on average not having an effect? Maybe in some theorized world with the right moderators and the right implementation it could, but on average it's not. And if you're a school thinking about how to use scarce resources, scarce professional development time, or thinking about effective instructional practices, you should probably look elsewhere.
Well, I would recommend it for schools in Lake Wobegon because they're all above average. And so, you know, it's interesting that you say that because in general, that would be my sense that, that I would not recommend this based on this, considering there's cost involved and things like that. So there are a few things that are coming out of this that I think we're going to give better insight. So there's somebody at Columbia who's doing a cost effectiveness study based using this. And then the other thing is I think that so there's something kind of interesting that happened here, is that we had random assignment and we had a very high level of participation and compliance with the randomization, which means we really had the curmudgeons in there. People who did not want to be in responsive classroom training, including the guy with the frowny face, instead of writing his name on his little button thing, you know, on his little badge, he put a frowny face. Like, we had people who did not want to be in there, and we see this. So I'm enough of a psychologist, and to say that, to just outright say, no, forget it, let's move on and find something better, is probably not the answer. Because I think there's some conditions that, I think there's school level conditions that produce, well, that contribute to higher levels of uptake. And so that is, and I would say, and the other thing is I say, you know, really put a lot of attention on academic choice. But there's something, even though it's not causal, I know, but there's, and I'm not talking about like, this is like a national thing that we should like put this in every single school around the country. But if educators come to me and they say, what should be my priorities in implementing responsive classroom, I'm going to say, well, think about it this way. But would I say, oh yeah, I would do this instead of that math intervention? No, I don't say that. I sort of say, it depends, which is probably not what teachers want to hear, but that's what I say.
I mean, I'm left saying I would really like a different outcome measure, because maybe it is what you're saying, that it's that you need a certain kind of classroom for it to work, but we don't even know, maybe it actually works on a larger scale if you're not then just having them calculate, you know, something that they memorize their multiplication tables for. So if there was some other outcome that could get into the use of skills that these practices are kind of directed, or then you might find something. So just in response to what I would say, which is, if you want to increase the math test, no, but if what you want to do is, but it clearly changes classroom practice, and if you think there are things in that classroom practice that you want, then maybe there's something positive.
That's a better, I like that one. I'm gonna that actually is very helpful. Yeah, that's so much better than what I was saying. Thank you. Yes?
You mentioned at the beginning that the control schools, did they get the training then after you finished with 5th grade?
Yeah. So one of the things when I wrote the grant, this is really probably useful for the students in here particularly, when I wrote the grant, I wrote in funding for the training, and I wrote it in for both the intervention and control condition. And that to me was, I was not going to do this study unless I could tell the teachers that they would be getting this at the end. And as it was, I was really, you know, here these teachers all, you know, the schools wanted this, and they were excited, they were going to get this. And then some of them were told they'd wait 3 years, which in a district is like an eternity. So first they were told they were going to just wait 1 year, and then we discussed this, and we said, we're going to have contamination problems and things. So we gathered all the principals. I've never had a moment like this. This was incredible. We gathered all the principals, and I explained this problem. And I said, we can just wait 1 year, as I told you in the beginning, but I'm actually worried about the effectiveness of the study overall. I think we're going to have contamination, and I think that we're less likely to get the effects that we want. And I'd really like this study to be something not just about you all doing something good for your own district, but also doing something for the field. But I'm leaving it up to you to discuss. And I had a discussion, I led a discussion, and they came to, and there was one principal who you know, there was lots of this and that, and one principal finally said, here's what I think. And then all the other principals were like, yeah, let's wait. And they decided to wait. So I think that that was an important decision, I think, in terms of the difference between intervention and control. But they all did get it. Some of the schools had already decided they didn't want to do it after, you know, like after waiting 3 years, enough things change in a district that they didn't want to. A couple.
You mentioned that you didn't find any significant effects on student engagement and efficacy.
Yeah.
But that's really out of my expectation. So what's your explanation about these results?
Yeah. So, you know, I did, so before doing this, we did a small quasi-experimental study of 6 schools, 3 intervention, 3 control. And we had a fair number of social skills that changed, and teacher-child relationships that, you know, were different between intervention and control. So I was surprised not to see any effects or any mediated and mediated relationships. So there are a couple things. One is we looked at 5th grade and we had the math teachers reporting on the kids' social skills, and I don't think I would do that again. So the math teachers know less about the kids' social skills than, for example, their English teacher during the day. And so I think if I were to do that again, I would change who was reporting on the kids, because that might have been a factor. The fact that kids did not report feeling more positive about their teachers or more positive about the school is still an enigma to me. And I don't understand the finding completely. I'm hoping that someone will do a replication study at some point and will, use those measures and do this all bigger and better and address those questions. Especially when people do like little studies, they find, like people, principals approach me and they say, can we use your measures and we'd like to do this, and they find improved social skills. So, there's a lot of these kind of little things, but we didn't see a thing. Oh, yeah.
Sorry, just to piggyback on that, so is that the case also for academic, for choice? Because I thought, I would have expected choice would be strongly related to students' engagement or social skills.
I don't know that we've looked at the practice composites in relation to those outcomes. That's something we'll do. That's a really, I don't know that we've done that. It's really good. Yes?
So your observations were of teacher practice, and so picking up on this thread about students, did you observe students' practice as well, or were all those self-report measures? Do you feel more engaged, I feel?
So we had 3 types of engagement measures. We had observed engagement, and then we had teacher report at the end of the year, and then we had the student report. And the student report were collected at the same time as the observed measures. And neither of those engagement measures were related to responsive classroom. They were related to some of the class scores. We also had class data, and they did relate to that, but they didn't relate to RC.
Okay, well, I'm going to let Sarah off the hook. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and